Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all well and staying safe. Welcome to this Tortoise thinking on cancel culture and whether it's even real. I'm Nimo and I'm a reporter at Tortoise. This is the first time I'm hosting a thinking, so forgive me if I'm a bit nervous. But I'm also really pleased that the first thinking that I get to edit is one that I am actually so passionate about. I can't wait to hear all your really interesting thoughts. So do join in the conversation on the chat that my colleague Luke will be moderating. And yeah, so before we get going this evening, I really just want to say that I'm aware that this discussion and this topic has been hashed and rehashed, many times on many forums. So, I don't want to fall into the circular discussions that have already kind of been had about this topic. I want to come away from this with like ideas and thoughts and perspectives that I perhaps hadn't considered before. And I hope that, everyone else will too. So that we can actually kind of move forward in this conversation. This topic is like really contentious, partly because the term cancel culture is used to describe so many different things. And, to avoid falling into the trap of semantics, which we will inevitably fall into because this is partially at least a discussion about language, I'm going to loosely define what I mean when I say cancel culture. And when I say it, I kind of mean, basically what I mean is like a collective online response to a usually powerful individual crossing a line, and that transgression, having consequences. And I think that that's the key here. It's not critique or even loads of people on Twitter saying really mean things, or someone saying that your column isn't very good. It has to have kind of material consequences. The most obvious that I think we can think of is someone losing their job, or getting dropped from a brand deal or a book deal, or losing money in some other way. The term has kind of a few origin stories, but like most colloquialisms and trendy terms on the internet, it kind of all started on Black Twitter a few years ago, and it was used flippantly as a joke, referencing when something was kind of over, it was out of fashion. But then it started more seriously being used later on to predominantly by Black women on the cancel R. Kelly hashtag. And it started out, as a vigilante strategy, kind of bringing justice and accountability to the doorsteps of people who kind of have used their power and money to shield themselves from it. And, I think this is where it gets really interesting. We're not here kind of to discuss whether cancel culture is good or bad, but instead I'm kind of interested in examining if it exists, and if it does, why it exists, and what it means for the way power operates and is kind of being reconfigured in modern society. And finally, also, what it has kind of morphed into in our current consciousness, where it unfortunately has kind of become an almost theatrical, and not to be hyperbolic, but a bit of a sadistic spectacle at times, when we kind of watch the downfall of someone on social media and we're all sat there with our imaginary popcorn watching it all unfold. So I guess, for me to stop rambling, I'd like to bring in and introduce Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media. And basically, I'd like to just kind of kick things off with a really kind of easy question, as I've already, kind of discussed the parameters of how I see cancel culture. What is your understanding of cancel culture? What does it mean to you, and what does it look like?
Well, I think that there's the cancel culture of moral panic, which is that it's a threat to free speech and civilized debate everywhere. An unruly mob, usually made up of people who are either Black, brown, progressive, leftist, female, gender non-conforming, who are shutting down debate through unjust criticism, and it's exacting, as you said, real life consequences. There's the cancel culture, which I love to hear about, where someone claims that they're being silenced from the pages of a national newspaper from their column. So we can also see it as a kind of political self-branding tool in which you cast your opponents as inherently illegitimate and unreasonable. So the fact that you are getting a backlash for something that you've said or something that you've done is itself a sign that free speech isn't functioning as it ought to be. And then I think that there's the kind of cancel culture of reality, which is a more kind of amorphous and nebulous phenomenon, which is one about, I think, informal social and cultural processes of accountability, largely driven on social media. And it can range from, you know, criticism, sometimes irony and joking and taking the piss, sometimes trolling, bullying, harassment, and sometimes concrete demands of the kind which amount to, as one of the slides said, a kind of cultural boycott. And this does exist in reality. And I think one of the things that we've got to do when we're talking about cancel culture is be really clear about which of these things we're talking about. Are we talking about, you know, the boogeyman conjured by Toby Young? Or are we talking about this kind of, you know, social media practice, the boundaries of which we haven't really clearly defined, and because of the nature of social media are probably impossible to define?
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating. I think that what you've kind of hit the nail on the head here is that it means so many different things, and it is a moving block. It's not fixed, it's fluid, and like coming from different people, it means something completely different. And I think that's where a lot of the contention has come from. You know, two people will be arguing heatedly about cancel culture, and then when you really ask them the questions, turns out that they're not talking about the same things at all. And that is the big, I think, part of the reason why it's so difficult to move forward in this conversation. It's like we kind of go in circles constantly trying to figure out how to kind of come to the center, you know, not politically, but generally. And it's really difficult to get there because we're not on the same page, we're on completely different planes. I'd like to also bring in Dr. Audrey Tang, who is a chartered psychologist and author of The Leader's Guide to Resilience, about what you think cancel culture is and what it's like, what you understand it to be, and how you think it manifests in society.
I agree with Ash in that there are so many different definitions of it. And that's the biggest problem that we have in any form of counseling, coaching, areas of psychology, is actually defining what people mean by it. I like the fact, Nimo, that you used the idea of having a consequence. The reason why I say that is because cancelling, when used in the media forum, is about cancelling a TV show, not giving it airtime anymore. Another variation or approach to cancel culture is if somebody's whole adoration and following is based on likes and tweets and followers, then actually getting rid of all of that suddenly does seem to cancel them. They're not given that space anymore. But the bigger problem comes in with no matter what outcome we want to achieve, we can't actually tell what is going to happen. So when Ash and yourself, when you both brought up the point about, is it a case of trolling? Is it bullying? Is it simply having consequences? Is it blacklisting, as people have been discussing in the chat as well? That question might be something that we have very clearly in our heads, but that may not be what happens. And the example I would give here is around the same time we had Lea Michele being criticized heavily for her behavior on set during Glee. And that criticism resulted in her apologizing, making amends, reaching out, explaining, well, actually, this is what happened, being able to answer for some of that behavior and try to make amends for it. But then we have the tragedy of Caroline Flack. That could have been seen as a call to cancel her, but would anyone say the outcome they really wanted was that? Of course not. But the problem is the behaviors that people go through when it comes to canceling anyone can involve bullying, can involve trolling. And even if we don't mean it in that way, we might just be speaking our truth. How is it going to be taken? We cannot predict that. And that's my biggest fear about cancel culture, when it is ill-defined, when people are using it quite flippantly, when it can entail nastiness.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point that you raised, because there is this obviously this gray area on, like, it's kind of this by any means necessary idea that kind of comes forward, where we kind of, I think that the obvious thing is, and the the really obvious point to make is obviously this is exacerbated and facilitated by social media and Twitter especially, because it's really easy to kind of get on these apps and effectively bully or troll people in order to, and you feel justified in that action. It is a righteous anger almost, this idea that you are allowed to behave in this way because this person has transgressed and has crossed the line and they should pay for it. What I'm a bit, would you say that Caroline Flack was a result of cancel culture though?
I would definitely say it was a result of bullying and the fact that she felt she had no escape. There's a beautiful quote by, I've just got it written down, Gillen, I think it is, who said, there is no act of sort of a pure aggression or tragedy that has not been propagated by feeling shamed or humiliated. And unfortunately, what can happen is, whether we mean to just embarrass or whether we're just voicing how we feel in perhaps more aggressive a way than we mean, when someone feels humiliated, when someone feels shamed, they're not going to change. They're not necessarily going to say, oh yes, I hold my hands up, this is what's going to happen. The first thing is they're going to get defensive. And the second thing is they might dig their heels in. They might go and seek support from other people who support their particular views as well. So this is not necessarily talking about Caroline Flack, but this is about anybody when they're feeling got at. But one outcome can be feeling that there's no escape, there is no one on their side, and that's the pure act of violence, but taken against herself. So I think it's whilst we may not have wanted that outcome, and no one would have wanted that, that cannot be removed from where cancel culture has been going. Any hashtag, any form of big social movement is going to affect the people who are at the forefront of it. Let's take the example of Christopher Jeffries. I don't know whether anyone remembers him, but this was a person who was hounded and hounded and hounded after the murder of Joanna Yates. They believed he was guilty. And there's been a documentary about him. He lost his job, he was shamed, he was persecuted, and he was innocent. And we forget that we are dealing with lives, with real people. And this is where social media can allow us to become very anonymous and therefore more vicious. And that's where, no matter whether we say we're driven by cancel culture or a movement or everyone saying it so it's okay, we need to appreciate we are making an impact on people.
I think,
yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to chime in here because I think that you're kind of getting at something really interesting, which is the way in which social media behavior, in a weird way, mimics the very worst of tabloid behavior. So the examples that you're giving of Caroline Flack and Chris Jeffries, they were people who primarily were demonized in the press, and then social media followed suit, particularly in the case of Caroline Flack. I was thinking, as you were talking of the case of Lucy Meadows, who was a transgender teacher, and she transitioned while in her teaching role. And because the school sent a letter to the parents so that they can tell their kids what's going on, explain that the teacher is now Miss Meadows and she'll be presenting differently, the Daily Mail got a hold of it. And she was hounded by the paparazzi. She was really demonized. There were op-eds saying that she should lose her job, you know, referring to her as a he, really horrible, nasty stuff. And she ended up taking her own life. And I think in some ways, you can't separate the phenomenon of social media mobbing and how it works to identify an individual and castigate them from the behavior of traditional media outlets. Because I think that in one sense, it's a bit of a copycat. So it's mimicking some of the tactics and some of the kind of emotional strategies of highlighting a person and holding them up for disdain and disapproval. But also when you look at the way in which the politics of cancel culture plays out, we talk about cancel culture generally when we're talking about people coming from a more progressive aligned political ideology, is that it's almost kind of a counterweight to this tabloid power. It's like, okay, well, hang on, you know, print media tends to skew to the right, broadcast media tends to reflect that. So this is what we can do here on social media. And for me, the interesting challenge is, well, how do you make social media a very different kind of culture? Because I don't see this wonderful new technology which connects us instantly, which could be the start of democratizing the public sphere. I don't see that the best thing for it is it to be just as bad as the News for the World or the Sun or the Daily Mail or what have you. And it's up to us to really try and create that different kind of it's a political culture as much as a social one.
Mm-hmm.
I fully agree with that, actually. It's the question becomes, though, when you have this platform of social media, is it actually our behavior that's shaping it, or is it have the people who run social media, do they actually have that control anymore? I question whether they do or not. So that would be a concern, but I fully agree that I think that's really important. But one thing social media has been able to do is it does allow you to feel a sense of community. It does allow you to find connections with other people. Now, whether those connections are appropriate or not, because talking about cancel culture, one thing it sends people off to do is I will find people who agree with me, and then we'll start a little group of our own, and that's what ends up becoming gaining voice. The Me Too movement was hugely important, because there people didn't feel alone. People actually said, well, I've said it, and now people are also saying it too, and that is wonderful. But for every wonderful connection, there can be a negative one too. How do you police that?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is a way to kind of temper the kind of vortex of cancel culture? Is there any way to kind of rein it in, make it work for us, and make it kind of what it was originally people kind of conceived of it in a way that it was, we can finally bring those people who are so elusive, who can kind of escape the retribution and the justice that they deserve? Is there any way to kind of perhaps separate or perhaps change the way that it has morphed and become this unfortunate and, well, maybe not unfortunate in terms of like, maybe it wasn't an accident, that this was inevitable, but is there any way to kind of temper this and change this and make it work for us, do you think?
I mean, I sort of think it just takes a bit of time.
Carry on, Ash.
I just think it takes a bit of time. One of my favorite writers on social media is Shoshana Zuboff, and she wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Brilliant, brilliant book. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. It's maybe not light reading, but it's pretty great. And one of the things that she says about social media is that it is this new technology. It's really heralding in, the fourth industrial revolution. And we are right now, the fourth technological revolution. And if you compare it to the industrial revolution, we're in like the dark satanic Mills time, where there's still no child labor laws and there's no trade unions and there's no chartism. This new technology has emerged and we're in the dark days of it. And it's going to take time to democratically kind of decide what are the kind of norms and limits we want on this technology. And I think at every period in history where you have had the emergence of a new communicative technology, whether that's the printing press or whether that's the telephone, you have had huge amounts of social upheaval following, because it fundamentally changes how we relate to one another. And those upheavals don't necessarily last forever. You're not necessarily in a permanent state of crisis, but there is a feeling of crisis that immediately follows the development of this technology.
Yeah, for sure. I can see that the chat is kind of going off as was kind of expected with this topic. And I, see the really interesting comments coming from Yasmin, as always, and some other people. And I definitely plan to come to some of you to bring these topics to, the platform so that Ash and Audrey can hear them as well. But I kind of also wanted to ask a question that's kind of that is kind of what we've been talking about, but a little bit different, about the permanence of the cancellation. And I think someone in the chat mentioned it too. There is obviously, people do talk about this in quite hyperbolic terms, in terms of like, oh, what are we supposed to do? Like, this person has to be banished to the caves and they can never come out, and they can never get a job again. So I guess who decides whether this is whether someone deserves a complete cancellation or a partial cancellation, or, and I guess this is tied to ideas of proportionality, whether the consequence of the transgression is proportionate to the offense, let's say, that they have committed. And, who decides this? And is there a way to kind of make it so that it is proportionate? And I guess this is the problems that comes with the court of public opinion.
I mean, I'm aware I've been talking a lot, but this is something I have very strong feelings about. Who gets to have their experience recognized as being cancelled? Because already it's a loaded and uneven playing field. So fuck it, dropping names. Suzanne Moore, who at The Guardian came under fire by quite a sizable portion of the readership for expressing views which many people deemed transphobic. What then happened is that 400 staffers got together and wrote a letter saying they were concerned about the editorial direction of The Guardian, and which also included Suzanne Moore's output. During that time, I think it was, 3 or maybe 4 trans members of staff had left, feeling that it was a really hostile place of work. Suzanne Moore decided, I think that this criticism of me is unreasonable. I don't feel supported enough by the editorial staff. I'm leaving my job. I'm not being sacked. I voluntarily left my job. This was then presented as cancel culture. So suddenly she's doing the I've been cancelled, the media rodeo. You've got Newsnight, you've got Radio 4, you've got, Unheard. You essentially kind of have a turbo booster to her career that many other journalists would kill for. So who really has had their freedom of speech suppressed or impacted? What I see here are multiple legitimate speech acts, from Suzanne Moore articulating opinions which I personally think are wrong, to there being some kind of, democratic organization within The Guardian itself of staffers who don't have that forward-facing, public, visible role saying, hang on, our opinion matters too. And then you had Suzanne Moore voluntarily leaving and seeking out employment elsewhere. But it's presented as cancel culture because then that's a way of saying the people who are criticizing me are fundamentally bad faith, aggressive, illegitimate. And this is where I think there's a political angle here, which really you make sense of via one of my favorite thinkers of all time, Gramsci. Because Gramsci talks about how political power is organized. It's not just through the state, it's through civil society. There's these institutions of civil society which dictate, our shared common sense. And this isn't a nice space where everyone agrees what's what and backs off. It's a contested space. It's a constant war of position, he calls it. And so within that, you're constantly trying to redefine what is and what isn't reasonable opinion, which is or isn't part of the shared common sense, who's a legitimate political actor and who isn't. And I think that cancel culture kind of illuminates both sides of this, both who's wanting to say, hey, this opinion, which we deem to be racist or transphobic or whatever it is out of bounds. And then you've got the flip side, which is saying this criticism of me is cancel culture because it's a fundamental infringement of my democratic rights, which means that you're an enemy of democracy. I always say that Gramsci makes sense of like pretty much anything that's going on in politics, and this time is no different.
I wish I paid more attention at uni so that I could understand Gramsci a bit more, but unfortunately those seminars, they weren't attended. So actually what you've kind of tapped into is a bit like you said, it's a question of power. And Yasmin in the chat earlier made a really interesting point about, is it cancel culture if the establishment does it? Yasmin, there you are. Elaborate.
Sure. Firstly, wanting to thank both the speakers so far, because I think I have heard and read a lot about what is loosely termed cancel culture and rolled my eyes quite often at people's takes. So it's nice to hear some theory brought to it. A couple of different thoughts, and you spoke about power, and I think so often for me, the question of power is missed. I mean, even if most people who talk about cancel culture in some way or another are talking, they sort of say my free speech is being censored or whatever. And, if we look at John Stuart Mill's idea of free speech, it was on the assumption that you have two people of equal power, two people presenting ideas on a level playing field, and those ideas will battle it out. But we know that there is no level playing field. We know that this idea of equal ideas, battling it out to find out which is the most superior one, is a theory that doesn't play out in the world or certainly doesn't play out in public discourse. And so I often I personally experience like some pretty violent cancel culturing, although it's never sort of brought under the umbrella of cancel culture, because it was the establishment, and by the establishment I mean traditional media, which then fed social media, which then traditional media reports on the social media as if it's real news, and you create this amazing cycle that feeds itself, and it's not considered cancel culture because it's what the norms and those empowered decide is acceptable. And this idea of battling out, what, as Ash was kind of talking about, who gets to decide what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable, I think is something that, that again, we're seeing shift, but I mean, I also think that when we talk about cancel culture, it's like the siren call. Like, you use the phrase cancel culture, and then everyone already has their opinions on it, and everyone already is like, yes, I know what side of the team I'm on this. And the term itself is so broad as to be almost useless, right? As I think Audrey was speaking to, it's like the term free speech. What does it even mean? We can take this term and apply it in any way we want. And so it becomes incredibly difficult to have any sort of meaningful conversation, because what we need to say, are we talking about mobs, which we can have a conversation about? Are we talking about the establishment deciding what can and can't be said? Are we talking about people who are historically marginalized trying to get some sort of accountability? They're all different dynamics, but because we get to use the term cancel culture, it means that we can all just fly whichever flag we want to, and we don't actually get to the crux of what is trying to be debated.
Absolutely, that is incredibly eloquently put, and I don't think I could say it better myself. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for letting me rant, Nimo. I was like, I have some views. Hello. But yeah, I'm just kind of I think it's frustrating to me, because what I find frustrating is the very clever way in which an experience of various historically marginalized communities, which have been systematically and over time been suppressed and silenced and censored, that this sort of victimhood being used as something that gives people more power, right? Just as Ash was talking about, if I am, somebody with massive book deals, lots of money, and I say I'm cancelled, all of a sudden I'm able to get more power, because people are like, oh, well, that person should be allowed to say what they want to say, right? And it's amazing to me, the sleight of hand where you can gain more power by talking about how silenced you are.
I think that this frustration is echoed by many in the room. And it's, this is part of the frustration of the term itself, cancel culture, which has kind of become so distorted, like you said, that nobody even knows what they're talking about anymore. And you mentioned free speech and what you were just saying. And actually, I would like to come to Matt Dancona, if I can, if he's here, but just to discuss free speech and like how these things intersect, and how, the big question, which I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, is cancel culture like impeding on free speech, and this nebulous idea, this vague idea of free speech that, we very rarely define. Is Matt there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Nima, and thanks everyone for being here. Well, I think it's really important to try, however numinous it has become as a word, as a phrase, to try and define cancel culture. And if we're by cancel culture, we just mean accountability and critique on social media, then I think that's fine, and it's a good thing, and it's a healthy thing. If by cancel culture we mean that there are consequences such as people losing their jobs or having book deals withdrawn, I think you have to be a bit careful in saying, oh, but they can go and get another book deal or another job, because that may be so, but it's a fairly shoddy version of natural justice. One has to, I think, see this in terms of whether the response is proportionate, whether withdrawal. Let's say the difficulty Selina Todd has had in getting a platform in Oxford. Was it right that Jordan Peterson had his fellowship taken away in Cambridge? People have different views. I don't think the answer is obvious, and I think sometimes the nuances and subtleties of these questions get lost. On the free speech question, I think we're living in a very strange time. And I'm old enough to remember when free speech was seen as a powerfully progressive force. It was very much associated with the left. You go back to Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. He wrote some of the most eloquent things on free speech ever written. W.B. Du Bois, John Lewis, the great congressman and Selma figurehead. You go to Mario Savio in the Berkeley free speech movement. These are people who saw free speech and its maintenance as being absolutely integral to social progress. And the reason they did was that they understood that actually if you start playing fast and loose with free speech, you can very, very quickly find yourself on the wrong end of the equation. We're going through a period now where progressives tend to be not very concerned by the right of people they disagree with to free speech. And that's fine, but understand that once you sell the pass on free speech, it may not always be the way you want it to. Consider what would a Trump second term would have been like for free speech and media freedoms in the United States. Look at Bolsonaro, look at Orban. It's just before we act frivolously about freedom of speech and say that it's exclusively an obsession of white privileged middle class males. Be careful, because that's not actually its history as a valued priority in a pluralist democracy. So I just urge caution, I think, in this whole debate, in assuming that essentially the debate is over and anyone who thinks differently is simply a dinosaur.
I don't think that you're a dinosaur or anyone in this conversation. But I think that it is I think that is probably the most interesting. And I think that it is very, the word isn't coming to my head right now, but basically, I think that it is very true that we should kind of approach this topic with caution effectively, which is what you said. And I think that we shouldn't be quick and, and I think that this discussion does encourage dichotomies and binaries in the way that we see, as Audrey mentioned earlier, in that everything is very one way or the other, and there is very, very little room for anything else.
May I jump in on that? Because I think that, I agreed with a lot of what Matt said, and I do think that it's the case that the left has abdicated the terrain of freedom in a very big way in recent years. And I think one of the reasons why that's happened is because the emergence of a particular kind of identity politics, I've been writing about this a lot recently, which is, where identity politics goes wrong and what's the good stuff that you need to keep. One of the things that's happened is because talking about universal values for lots of time just meant talking about values which were defined in the interests of a ruling class, which is generally white, rich, male, of that sort, that you have to go, well, hang on, we've got to look towards the subjective experiences of marginalized people for the truth, right? And that's, not a bad thing to go, here are these people who've been excluded from the terrain of, public discourse, and so we're gonna turn to them. But I think that there was a larger retreat, and part of that retreat was from thinking about universalist values at all. And I'm a old-fashioned vulgar Marxist. I believe in a kind of insurgent universalism and insurgent humanism. And I think that one of the things that the left does have to do is talk really seriously about freedom of speech, because what's happening at the moment is that freedom of speech is often being wielded by bad faith actors to pursue a kind of culture war, which is this, the culture was made up of these micro events which are endlessly litigated, and it's just energy sapping. It's incredibly boring as well. Whereas actually you can integrate, I think, the discussion we're having about these informal and imperfect methods of collective accountability on social media, or the wider discussion about freedom of speech and assaults on freedom of speech, which I think, as Yasmin was saying, are led by the establishment. Because what's interesting to me is that when we talk about cancel culture, we don't talk about campus culture to do with cancel culture. We don't then talk about Prevent, where you've had thousands of events referred through the Prevent channel, speakers being barred from talking at universities, mostly Muslim, not always, because they're associated or seem to be associated with terrorism. Now, often this is on very flimsy evidence, not because these people actually are terrorists or terrorist sympathizers, is that this is a racialized program which casts freedom of speech and academic freedoms by Muslims as inherently suspect. For me, that's a real threat to freedom of speech. And it seems like a terrain that the left, should we abdicate fighting for freedom of speech, we leave open, I think, to, quite nefarious forces, which will crack down on all of us. So I do agree with Matthew about the need to sort of reclaim this terrain and not to write off freedom of speech as purely a bad faith conversation. But I think we should also recognize that part of the reason why people feel it is a bad faith conversation is because a lot of the time it is a bad faith conversation.
Yeah. And I think that is why a lot of people are so skeptical when they hear people bring out the free speech card, so to speak. And, they discuss their freedom of speech being infringed upon without really, without really considering what that might mean and what that really looks like. Actually, I think Jan McAverish in the chat has been discussing this, who is, I think, are you there, Jan?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. And you are a part of the Free Speech Union, if I read that correctly.
Yeah.
You have to say.
Yeah, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, given that it's 7 o'clock in the evening, but I'm Education and Events Director at the Free Speech Union. And that's something I'm actually really proud of. So I will defend the Free Speech Union. I know people don't respect it quite often they don't respect it, but I think they're people who have prejudices against the people who are the figurehead or the person who's a figurehead, and I think they're not actually bothering to explore the work that the Free Speech Union actually does in handling cases. So, but I think that will be corrected over time, because I think the work it does will become much more evident that it's necessary, and it's serious work. And I think the kind of work that needs to be done here is to recognise that cancel culture goes all the way down, and so it isn't about celebrities. The kind of model is set in the public sphere at the kind of the silly level of celebrities, but I think it goes all the way up to Samuel Paty and Charlie Hebdo. The idea that there are ideas or images that are just intolerable in our shared space of the public square is something that is used to justify, the most barbarous behaviour. But then it goes all the way down, I think, through the kind of the person in the workplace who is disciplined for saying something. It goes through to the student who is disciplined for having a chat amongst their friends, which is then shared and goes public. And it goes all the way down, I think, to teenagers. And I can see this now. Seems to be becoming a kind of norm, a social norm, where teenagers, even amongst themselves, will find the one expression of something or one word used just intolerable. And I think loads of parents are having this experience in their own homes with their children, particularly around things like the trans issue, where it's become very, very difficult to have a conversation about things because a word is a tripwire now. And I think, it's all very well kind of saying, oh, well, we don't really know what it means. It's been confused because what's free speech anyway, because these people abuse it and that person claims to be cancelled when really they're not. I think you've got to really take seriously what is actually happening at all levels of society. And we're moving towards a very, very uncivilized state of affairs where you cannot have discussions that are good faith, that are open, and that people can actually express what they really think. Because if people don't feel that they can express what they're thinking, or even experiment with ideas or use the language that is most comfortable to them, then you cannot have a dialogue. All you have is the exertion of power by people who already have power. So if you're really interested in the powerless, you have to be on the side of free speech. I can't see any kind of equivocation of that. It is really clear.
I'd like to add to that, to what Jan said, to what Mata said and what Asha said. One thing that we haven't actually talked about is that cancel culture in itself is hugely reductionist, banning people, telling people they can't come and speak at university. I thought university was the place where we need to be able to entertain different opinions. One of the key things that we need to appreciate is if we are simply just cancelling people, they don't ever get a chance to explain or verse or voice the views that they've got. And I think that can be very important, because we might have misunderstood, certainly if it's on social media in 164 characters or whatever it might be, what they truly mean. And by asking them to be answerable to that opinion, we find out whether it's toxic. Not only that, but we remember how to debate. We remember how to ask questions. And related to this is a question that I saw in the chat, how do we come forward from this? If I'm already saying, yes, I believe it's reductionist, and one example of that reductionism is Dominic Cummings' behaviour. Yes, bad behaviour, driving to Barnard Castle. But what happened? We all just called for him to be cancelled, lose his job. There are so many other options other than cancellation, other than losing someone's job, that no one entertained. What about community service? What about giving his time to volunteer for something? What about a fine or something like that? We've already shown how reductionist cancel culture can be if it's just simply got a job or no job. What we're better off doing is reminding people that they have to be able to explain their opinions, that they have to be able to stand up for the one thing that they might say is a throwaway comment. Call them out instead. It's a much more open dialogue approach. It allows us who are calling out to actually open the dialogue and have that conversation. It allows people to be taught how to have open conversation and dialogue. And if we can actually do it in a space which doesn't create defensiveness, if it's not done on a public forum, we are more likely to enforce some kind of change in mindset, because that person isn't then defensive. If you can actually ask somebody simply, well, what did you mean by that? Or even voice your own view. I was actually quite offended by that. What were you trying to say? That opens the dialogue. It allows for conversation. It allows for shifting. Cancelling just simply cuts it dead. That's the idea of cancellation. Learning how to debate, learning how to back up your views, learning how to ask questions makes a huge difference, and it pushes us perhaps a little way towards the society we're trying to nurture. By simply not allowing people to speak, by simply not allowing any debate to be had, I think we have a few problems.
Oh, I think Ash is trying to speak, but she's muted.
I think there's maybe something I'd like to sort of share from personal experience, and that is I live with my head just immersed in the cesspit of social media every day. It's probably having a terrible effect on my brain. It's a bit like huffing glue. I can feel it just smoothing the creases that once were a healthy functioning brain. And one of the things that happens a lot is that I get an awful lot of racist and misogynist abuse. And I'm not just talking here about opinions that I might find unpalatable. I'm talking about the worst slurs, death threats, sexually degrading imagery, Photoshop pictures, and they see that on a real daily basis. Now, I've always felt very conflicted about what to do about this. I've wondered, would it be the right thing to do to go to the police? Is it the right thing to do to call it out when I see it? Is it the right thing to do to try and respond? I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. Generally, I've not gone to the police because, no snitching in it, but also, I've wondered what's proportionate. What's proportionate for me to do with the platform that I have when these people who clearly don't have happy lives, are calling me a packy, or, saying that I deserve to be set on fire, asking if I've had FGM, recording hate wank material. These are all real things that have happened, by the way. And one of the questions that I have and have had to deal with is, what level of real life consequences do I want for these people? Because if I'm honest, the answer isn't none, right? I don't want zero real life consequences for these people. But when things have happened and I've, called somebody out for it, there was a guy who I think lost his job in a supermarket. And I didn't feel good about that either. I felt terrible about it. Doesn't mean that what he did was right. And I wonder what the experience must have been like for the people of color that he worked with. If he's spending his evenings DMing me horrendous racist abuse, is it right that they had to work with somebody who did that? Who knows what he also got up to in his private life? No idea. And I think that one of the things that we lose is that we lose the fact that these are really difficult questions, that we can say, hey, we're passionate defenders of free speech, but actually all of us have got some personal sense of there being a line. We can say, hey, all's fair in love and war. If you dish it out on social media, you should take it on social media. But actually at some point we come to a line where we go, hang on, that went too far. And even if this person did something really wrong, there's a level of consequence to that I feel uncomfortable with. And I think that one of the issues that I have with the Free Speech Union a lot of the time is that it presents an idea that you can always have a civilized debate. And that if only we weren't so intolerant, that would be possible. No, I don't think that's possible either. I'm a evangelist for Article 10 rights of freedom of expression. I really am. But one of the things about that Article 10 right is about the limits of the protected speech are constantly being contested. And that's something that we've got to hash out. We can't just pretend that conflict between the right to free expression and the right to safety from harassment and discrimination and real life harm, that sometimes these things don't come into conflict, because they do.
Absolutely. And I think with that, I think you've actually touched on the really human element of this that we sometimes miss when we talk about these things in the abstract, and when we talk about people losing their jobs or people, facing the consequences, whatever that might be. And there are, on the both ends of this, people who have to grapple with what's just happened. And I think that there's probably exemplified in the Christopher Cooper, Amy Cooper situation in New York, when, the internet just took it upon themselves to go as far as they wanted, and she lost her job. And he had an interview, I think, a few days later, a few weeks later, and he said, actually, I didn't feel good about her losing. I didn't want her to lose her job. I don't want people to find her address. I don't want her to be doxxed. I think that I think that it went too far. And I think that there is a moment where these things kind of leave both the cancelled and the cancellee, and it kind of is above everyone, and it is this tidal wave of cancelling, if you will, and there's very little you can do to stop it once it's begun. And yeah, I do want to quite quickly go to, I've been reading over the chat, going up, because I've not been paying as much attention as I probably should have been, but there have been interesting comments from Besenica. I'm so sorry, I've butchered your name.
That's okay. It's pronounced Banseca.
Banseca, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Hi, it's really great, first of all, to just say this is a really nuanced discussion, which is really nice and really refreshing, because sometimes this stuff gets really ugly and really polarized really quickly. I guess I just wanted to really bring in this idea of power, which I think it was Yasmin spoke about earlier on, because I think that for me is always what this argument kind of comes back to. And I know there's instances like the Caroline Flack stuff, for example, or other instances that maybe don't pertain to this, but I think a lot of the time when we are talking about cancel culture, let's be honest, it is often coming back down to people who said stuff that's racist, homophobic, sexist, etc. That's often the bracket within which we're talking about it. And we're talking about kind of young progressive people who've kind of clubbed together and called out X, Y, and Z, David Starkey, for example. And so for me, it always comes back to that issue of power, and what is the power underlying all of these dynamics, and who has the power to say what. And I think in some senses, although social media is like a cesspit of awfulness in many respects, I also think social media does have the capacity for us to act in a way that is quite collective. And collectivism, I think, is really quite a big threat to powerful people. Collectivism, I think, within the last 30 years in this country is something that's really been kind of squashed down on politically, I think it's fair to say. So I think the idea of kind of young progressive people clubbing together and deciding to kind of use their voices collectively to shout down someone and say, hey, that's not cool, that's not okay, this person shouldn't be occupying such a prestigious position, and you know, we'd like to see some consequences essentially for what they've said. I think in some ways that is a threat to, I suppose, the individualism that's kind of purported or put onto us these days, as much as a negative thing as social media really is. And also, just to pick up on the point that I think was made from the lady from the Free Speech Union, and apologies, I haven't remembered your name, but there is this idea of like, you know, we should allow for reasonable discussion and reasonable debate. And again, this comes back to power, because who decides what is reasonable and what is not? Who decides what's okay to say about me as a Black person? Is that left in the hands of white people? Do Black people get an equal say about that or not? So again, like so many of these things that are said in a way that I actually find quite idealistic and unrealistic, actually like they ignore the very real power dynamics that exist there. So I think that's really, really important to underline. And also just to say as well, like free speech it's not some kind of unqualified right, you know, all these rights have to be balanced out against each other. We're not implementing these rights in a vacuum, and it is kind of a case-by-case basis. And again, that's not a really like neat packaged way to look at things at all. It's frustrating, but you know, that's what life is, isn't it? So I think we also have to have a degree of understanding that, you know, these things have to be balanced out, and there's not always a clear line with these things. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much for contributing. That was a really insightful and interesting point to add. And I think that, well, I can speak for myself, I completely agree with you in what you've just said. I want to very quickly pick up a point that I just have been thinking about myself after I read an article. I know that we haven't got very long left, but there was an article in The Atlantic titled How Capitalism Drives Cancel Culture. And it was really interesting piece that made me kind of double back on what I've always kind of thought about these two things. And I was like, hold on a moment, where are you going with this? And the writer basically discusses how this uses the term, the iron law of woke capitalism, which I'm not going to lie, I'm not a huge fan of the term, but basically she talks about how corporations and institutions and basically use these, you know, gravitate towards low cost, high noise signals, basically as a substitute for genuine reform. And one of the ways to do this is to lay off low level workers for perceived slights on social media when people kind of go at them. And I think that this is perhaps and this is kind of what you were talking about earlier, Ash. And one of the examples is a man called Emmanuel Cafferty, who in America was a truck driver. And, you know, I think a lot of you might have heard the story how he, you know, put his hand up to signal to a car and it looked like an okay signal or something like that. And it was then suggested that it was the white supremacist symbol for, you know, and he was a white supremacist and therefore he should lose his job. And he ended up losing his job. And there was an interview which he said something really poignant about, you know, like, what do I do here? Like, I can learn from my mistakes, but I haven't done anything wrong here. It's like I've been struck by lightning. And it was just a bit much. And I really kind of sat back when I've been really monitoring how I engage with these kinds of things now. And is it another example of capitalism and like these institutions subsuming what was radical acts for their own, you know, to kind of avoid actually doing the work themselves? What do you think? You're muted, Ash.
Sorry, I'm all like, I feel like that old auntie who's on Zoom and just like never clocks when they've been muted. I mean, I think this is also where you can't parcel off freedom of expression from other rights, in particular workplace rights. And again, like, not to dunk on the Free Speech Union, because I'm sure that you handle a lot of cases that I don't know about, but I'm a member of a degular union, and I expect them to stand up for my rights as an NUJ member if I'm treated unfairly in the workplace because it's been deemed that I've said something on social media in a way which is, you know, has no impact on how I do my job and I've been sacked. That's what a trade union is for. A trade union is also for, you know, making sure that people aren't on these like hyper precarious contracts, which means they can be let go at any minute. So when we're talking so much about people losing their jobs, I do think that has to be very firmly contextualized with a whole set of other rights, which can be defended collectively and perhaps more strongly if we don't try and parcel off freedom of speech from these other freedoms and from these other rights. As for the point about capitalism, I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about is the extent to which cancel culture is a millennial phenomenon, right? We're talking about people aged 35 and under. And I think that a really important piece of context to this isn't simply that this is the age group which is most likely to be very familiar and at home on social media. This is an age group which is pretty totally excluded from the terrain of political power, right? You look at America, it has been described by some as a gerontocracy. You know, the majority of its political leaders are firmly over the age of 70, right? So we're talking about well out of working age. In this country, where, you know, our cabinet might be a bit younger, but if you are a person who has voted in line with the rest of your age group, you haven't been part of, you know, in a winning election for decades. You don't know what it's like to have voted in an election, a general election, and win it. Whereas, you know, if you're a baby boomer, quite the opposite. We're talking about trends here, not, you know, I'm aware that there are young Tories and there are, you know, baby boomer socialists, but generally there is a complete lack of representation at the political level for, you know, millennials and below. And so I think it's no wonder that social media, which provides you with quite a dizzying sense of your own agency, you know, I'm not lying when I say using Twitter is a bit like huffing glue. It's kind of a mad rush. Then you go, where did all that time go? Is that people turn to social media as a means of seeking out and experiencing a kind of political agency, which they literally don't have in any other aspect of their lives.
That is a very interesting point, which could be a thinking in and of itself, how millennials and Zoomers use the internet and how we use it as the one last like grasp of power like that we've got in this kind of nightmarish world that we're living in right now. We are so close to the end. So, and I want to ask both you, like you, Ash, and you, Audrey, where do we go now? Like, what is, I think this is the big like last question that means nothing, but I let you guys kind of take the floor and, you know, tell me, what do you think is the next, you know, like you said, Ash, this was the beginning. We're at the very beginning of, like, you know, we are the cavemen of technology at the moment. What's next?
Well, one of the things that I would always teach my students is the power of being able to have a voice and the power of debate and the power of listening to all sides before you make a judgment. We are there to teach critical thinking. We are there to teach the fact that people may have opinions that we don't agree with, but if we find out more, then we might be able to form an opinion of our own based on that. However, one of the key things that seems to have come out here is there is a line that most of us have of what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, what has changed with the times, the things that we do need to be aware of, not to necessarily be part of woke culture, but just simply to be in polite society right now. But that line is not necessarily something that we are going to get from the people in charge, from politicians, from people collectively shouting on social media, because yes, absolutely, if people don't feel they have a voice and that's the only outlet, that's the place where they've got control, the behavior is going to be very different when somebody's thinking in a balanced way. We need to have responsibility ourselves to know what our lines are, to know how to express our own views, and to know how to think more broadly before we make a judgment. And that's something that we need to take on ourselves. So that would be probably my approach to managing how to respond to people behaving in cancellation type ways, how to respond when you hear a view that is abhorrent or toxic or something that you don't understand how someone can hold that, because that will allow us to challenge, that will allow us to find out more, that will allow us to raise our own voices too.
Very well said. What about you, Ash? You've just been muted.
Here we go. I suppose my most honest answer to this is I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. I don't know how this is going to develop. I don't think it's meaningful to try and distinguish between real life and online anymore. I think that distinction's collapsed, but it does seem to me that the agency we feel online is not being replicated in other aspects of our public life. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is I've been thinking a lot about the Black Panthers. And it's not just because like they look really cool and they had the berets. It's because they were really, really good at coalition building. And whenever we remember one aspect of the Panthers, we tend to forget another. So if we remember them as militant radicals, we forget that they were born of a reading group. When we remember them as the people who did, social care provision, testing for sickle cell and the free breakfast programs, we forget about another aspect of the Black Panthers, which was contesting mayoral elections. They exist in this wonderful round. But one of the things that I really rate about the Panthers is that they understood the importance of self-organization in real life. So freedoms weren't just abstractly constituted. You were embodying them and making them through your real life political practice again and again and again. So I think that one of the ways in which we deal with cancel culture isn't by trying to come up with here are the new rules of social media and let's hold everybody to them. I think it's about having a kind of counterweight elsewhere in our political and social lives, which makes us feel like we have a grip on shaping the world around us. So we don't just have to turn to Twitter and, at somebody at the speed of light. We can have perhaps a more meaningful engagement with the political terrain. I've also just read a book about the Black Panthers. So now obviously I think be like the Black Panthers is the answer to everything. I'll read a different book in 2 weeks and say something completely different.
Oh no, I completely relate to that. My entire political ideology is the last documentary I just watched. So we've gone over time, but I think that was almost inevitable. This has been such an enriching, nuanced discussion that I'm so glad that it's happened this way, because I was kind of scared that it was going to descend into I've been cancelled, no, I've been cancelled, and it's not that at all. So I don't even know if I can sum up all that's been said. I think that we will definitely hopefully save the chat and go over it with the hundreds of messages that have been sent. Thank you so much for coming to this Thinking. This is the second Battle for Truth Thinking in this series, and the next one will be sometime next week. Thank you so much for coming to this court of thinking, and thank you Ash and Audrey for joining us.